There is a house where the wind does not pass quietly. It presses against the shutters, as if searching for a way back in. A house where silk curtains once moved with Mediterranean light, and later hung motionless in rooms heavy with absence. A house that absorbed whispers of power, grief, ambition, betrayal, and death, until its walls seemed to breathe them back at night. On a private stretch of land on Skorpios Island, surrounded by waters so blue they appear unreal under the Greek sun, stands the Onassis family mansion, a structure conceived as a sanctuary, engineered as a fortress of prestige, and remembered as a monument to sorrow. Built not merely of stone and marble, but of ego, legacy, and relentless pursuit of permanence, it became the silent witness to some of the most intimate and devastating chapters in 20th century history. The mansion was meant to defy time. Instead, it became trapped inside it. The mansion rises from the island's uneven terrain with deliberate authority. Pale stone walls reflect the Ionian sunlight during the day, but at dusk they darken into a muted grey, absorbing the fading light as if swallowing it whole. Cypress trees surround the structure in disciplined rows, their thin silhouettes trembling in the evening breeze. The scent of salt and pine resin lingers in the air. From a distance, the estate appears serene, a Mediterranean retreat untouched by the noise of the world. Up close, it feels different. The gravel driveway crunches sharply underfoot. The sound carries farther than expected, as though the land itself amplifies intrusion. The facade is elegant but restrained. No flamboyant excess, only the quiet confidence of immense wealth. Wide terraces overlook the sea. Arched windows frame horizons that dissolve into mist. White stone steps lead to heavy wooden doors that open into cool interior corridors where the air feels permanently shaded. This was the chosen refuge of Aristotle Onassis, a man who built one of the largest private shipping empires in the world. He acquired Skorpios in the early 1960s, transforming the once wild island into a cultivated Eden. Thousands of trees were imported, roads were carved into hillsides, beaches were reshaped, water systems were engineered to sustain luxury and isolation. Every architectural decision was intentional, designed to create a controlled paradise. Inside the mansion, floors of polished marble reflected filtered light from tall windows. The ceilings were high, but not cavernous, creating intimacy rather than grandeur. Persian carpets muted footsteps. Heavy drapery softened the sea's brightness. The walls held artwork collected from Europe and beyond, not ostentatious displays, but calculated statements of power and taste. The house was not simply a residence, it was an assertion. In the main salon, long glass panels overlooked the Ionian Sea. At sunset, the water burned gold, and the room glowed with a muted amber hue. It was here that private conversations unfolded. Discussions of global shipping contracts, political alliances, personal rivalries. Heads of state and cultural icons arrived by yacht and helicopter, their arrivals slicing through the island's otherwise disciplined quiet. When Jacqueline Kennedy married Onassis in 1968, the mansion became a focal point of global attention. Photographers stationed offshore, lenses aimed toward the terraces. The world speculated about what occurred behind those shuttered windows. The estate, once an isolated retreat, transformed into a symbol of controversial union, American political legacy merging with European maritime wealth. Yet within the walls, silence often dominated. The rooms were large enough to hold gatherings of diplomats and celebrities, yet they were equally capable of magnifying solitude. Long corridors extended with minimal ornamentation, their symmetry almost clinical. During the quiet hours after guests departed, the mansion settled into an unsettling stillness. The ticking of distant clocks echoed more loudly than expected. Footsteps reverberated along marble floors. Curtains shifted with subtle drafts that felt colder at night. Onassis walked these halls with deliberate pace. Staff members recalled the intensity in his presence. A man accustomed to command, rarely uncertain, rarely vulnerable. But the mansion did not bend to personality. It absorbed everything equally, triumph and tension, laughter and argument. Outside, waves broke rhythmically against the shoreline below the cliffs. The sound was constant, a low, percussive reminder of isolation. Skorpios was reachable only by sea or air. The separation from the mainland was both luxury and confinement. The mansion's balconies offered panoramic views, yet beyond those views lay distance, physical and emotional. At night, lights from the estate could be seen from boats passing in the distance, a glowing structure in the darkness floating above black water. Inside, chandeliers cast elongated shadows along corridor walls. In certain corners, the air felt heavier, as if saturated by years of unresolved tension. The island was purchased to secure legacy. The mansion was built to contain it, but structures do not choose what they remember. They hold everything, and Scorpios began to hold more than celebration. The sea surrounding Scorpios does not change its rhythm for human tragedy. It continues to rise and fall against the rocky edges of the island with indifferent persistence. Yet within the mansion, something shifted in the early 1970s, not in architecture, not in decor, but in atmosphere. The air grew denser. Conversations became shorter. Doors closed more often. The terraces that once hosted gatherings of political figures and aristocrats began to feel like observation decks over a kingdom growing unstable from within. Inside the study, a room lined with dark wood shelves and heavy leather chairs positioned deliberately toward the horizon, Aristotle Onassis spent increasing amounts of time alone. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and polished oak. Files lay stacked in precise order on the desk. Telephones connected the island to New York, Paris, London. Deals were negotiated across oceans while the Ionian sun blazed beyond the glass. But even in this command center of global influence, personal matters began to eclipse corporate strategy. The mansion, originally engineered as a sanctuary, became a chamber of tension. Its symmetry no longer felt calming. Its silence was no longer restful. The corridors seemed longer at night. The distance between rooms felt deliberate, as though the house itself encouraged separation. Jacqueline Kennedy occupied private quarters facing the eastern side of the estate. The rooms were elegant but restrained, with pale fabrics and understated furnishings. Large windows framed the sunrise over the water, filling the bedroom with pale morning light that softened the severity of the architecture. Yet the brightness did not dispel the growing emotional distance within the mansion. The marriage between Onassis and Jacqueline had brought global scrutiny to Scorpios. Boats hovered offshore with cameras. The press speculated about wealth, motives, and power. But within the walls, life settled into something quieter and colder. Staff moved discreetly through hallways, footsteps softened by carpets imported from Europe. Meals were served in a dining room where long tables could seat dignitaries, yet often only two places were set. Silverware gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, their reflections fractured across polished surfaces. The sound of utensils against porcelain echoed more than expected. Then came March 1973. The news did not arrive gently. It cut through the estate with brutal abruptness. Alexander Onassis, the heir, the future of the empire, had been fatally injured in a plane crash in Athens. The mansion absorbed the shock before anyone could articulate it. The Ionian wind that evening carried a sharp chill. Curtains near the west-facing windows moved restlessly. The sky over Scorpios darkened earlier than usual, heavy clouds gathering without rain. Staff members later recalled that the estate felt unnaturally silent, as if sound itself hesitated to travel through its corridors. When Onassis returned to the island after the funeral, the mansion seemed altered. The study remained intact. The marble floors still reflected light. The sea still glittered under the afternoon sun. But something intangible had fractured. In the main salon, the same glass panels that once framed celebratory gatherings now reflected a solitary figure pacing slowly. The vastness of the room amplified isolation. A house designed to project permanence now confronted mortality. Alexander had walked these terraces. His footsteps had once echoed along the upper balcony overlooking the sea. He had swum in the surrounding waters. His presence had been embedded into the daily rhythm of the estate. Now the mansion held only absence. Onassis withdrew further into himself. The study became darker. Curtains remained drawn longer during the day. Cigarette smoke thickened the air. Conversations grew clipped. The mansion's geometry, once precise and balanced, began to feel oppressive, as though every straight line emphasized loss. Even the island's natural beauty began to feel distant. Olive trees shimmered under sunlight, but their movement no longer invited admiration. The beaches, reshaped for comfort and exclusivity, lay undisturbed. The private chapel on the island, constructed of pale stone near the shoreline, took on new significance. Its interior, small and austere, carried the scent of candle wax and incense. It would soon become central to the family's grief. Inside the mansion, time slowed. Clocks ticked with mechanical insistence. The echo of each tick carried through hallways late at night. The wind against the shutters sounded sharper, more intrusive. The estate's grandeur did not shield it from sorrow. Instead, its scale magnified it. Rooms built to host world leaders now contained mourning. The walls did not speak, they did not crack, they did not visibly shift. But those who moved through the house sensed a heaviness, a psychological weight that settled into every corner. Scorpios had been engineered as a controlled paradise. Now it felt like a sealed chamber of grief. The chapel stands only a short distance from the mansion, yet the walk toward it feels longer than the geography suggests. A narrow stone path curves through manicured greenery, past olive trees whose leaves shimmer silver under shifting light. The air near the shoreline carries a mixture of salt and damp earth. Waves break steadily against the rocks below, a rhythm unchanged by human catastrophe. It was here, within this small white structure overlooking the Ionian Sea, that Alexander Onassis was laid to rest in 1973. The burial altered the psychological center of Scorpios. Before, the mansion had been the island's heart, the architectural assertion of power, ambition, permanence. After the burial, the chapel became its emotional gravity. The estate no longer revolved solely around wealth or prestige. It revolved around loss. From the upper terrace of the mansion, the chapel is visible beyond a gentle slope of trees. On certain evenings, when the sun lowers behind thin clouds, its pale walls reflect a muted glow. It appears almost suspended between land and sea. The proximity means that every glance toward the horizon carries a reminder of what rests beneath the soil. Inside the mansion, subtle changes took root. Curtains remained drawn for longer hours. Staff conversations dropped to near whispers. The once frequent arrivals of yachts became rare. Helicopter blades no longer cut through the island's sky with celebratory urgency. Aristotle Onassis moved through the house with slower steps. The study, once alive with negotiations and calculated risks, grew dimmer. Lamps replaced daylight. Papers accumulated without the same decisive precision. The scent of tobacco thickened the air. The windows overlooking the sea remained shut more often, muting the sound of waves that once felt triumphant, but now seemed indifferent. Grief does not announce itself loudly in architecture. It reveals itself in atmosphere. The marble floors felt colder. The vast main salon, once designed to host dignitaries, now amplified emptiness. Even the acoustics seemed altered. Footsteps echoed with sharper clarity, as though the house refused to absorb sound. In the dining room, the long polished table reflected overhead light with sterile perfection. Fewer chairs were occupied. Conversations rarely extended beyond necessity. Silverware touched porcelain with restrained delicacy. Outside the windows, the Ionian Sea glittered in bright contradiction to the interior mood. Then, in 1975, another shift descended upon the island. Aristotle Onassis himself died in Paris after prolonged illness. His body was transported back to Scorpios. The journey returned him to the land he had shaped according to his vision, the island he had transformed from wilderness into controlled paradise. The funeral took place under subdued skies. The chapel doors opened once more. Wind moved through cypress branches with a low, persistent whisper. The scent of incense mixed with the brine of the sea. Those present stood against a backdrop of immense natural beauty that offered no comfort. With Onassis buried beside his son, the mansion's identity fractured further. It was no longer simply the residence of a titan of industry. It became a mausoleum-adjacent structure, a house whose view included the graves of its patriarch and heir. The psychological weight intensified. The island, once acquired to secure legacy, now physically contained it in stone and soil. After his death, ownership passed to Christina Onassis. She inherited not only financial power, but the island and its mansion, and the emotional residue embedded within them. Christina's relationship with Scorpios was complex. The mansion represented both inheritance and burden. The corridors that once echoed with her father's authority now carried the silence of finality. The terraces overlooking the sea no longer framed triumph, but memory. When she visited, the estate briefly regained activity. Lights illuminated balconies, staff prepared rooms. Yet even during these periods, a subtle tension lingered. The house seemed unable to return to its original state. The laughter that occasionally resurfaced never fully dissolved the underlying weight. By night, the mansion's windows glowed against the surrounding darkness, visible from distant boats. From afar it appeared as it always had, a symbol of immense wealth and exclusivity. But inside, rooms held layered histories. Every polished surface reflected absence. Every corridor led not only to another chamber, but to a memory. The sea continued its endless motion. The wind continued pressing against shutters. Olive trees continued trembling under moonlight. Scorpios remained beautiful. The mansion remained intact, but permanence had revealed its illusion. By the late 1970s, the mansion no longer radiated dominance. It radiated inheritance. When Christina Onassis assumed control of Scorpios, she inherited a structure heavy with unresolved grief. The estate stood immaculate, white stone walls intact, terraces polished, gardens manicured with disciplined precision. Yet the emotional architecture of the place had shifted irrevocably. The house no longer symbolized ambition in motion. It symbolized what remained after ambition had collapsed inward. Christina arrived by yacht on certain summers, the vessel cutting cleanly through the Ionian waters before anchoring offshore. From the upper balcony, the mansion overlooked her arrival as it had once overlooked her father's. The sea breeze carried salt and faint diesel from the engines, dissipating slowly into the island's vegetation. Staff moved with renewed urgency when she came. Shutters opened, linens aired, crystal polished until flawless. Yet activity could not erase atmosphere. Inside, the corridors retained their elongated stillness. The marble floors reflected Christina's steps as she moved through the central hall. Her presence did not dominate the mansion the way her father's had. It drifted through it, quieter, more fragile. The study remained largely untouched, its dark wood shelves still lined with ledgers and correspondence from another era. Dust gathered in corners too subtle for immediate notice. The chapel below the slope, visible from several vantage points within the estate, anchored the psychological landscape. Two graves rested within its enclosure, father and son. From certain windows of the mansion, their resting place aligned precisely with the horizon, as though the architecture itself insisted on remembrance. Even during gatherings, the estate felt contained. Christina hosted guests at intervals, business associates, social figures, acquaintances from across Europe and America. Laughter occasionally surfaced across the terrace during dinners illuminated by soft golden light. Glasses touched in restrained celebration. Music drifted outward toward the sea, but the island did not echo with festivity as it once had. Sound dissipated quickly into the surrounding darkness. The mansion's layout intensified this containment. Large rooms opened into one another, yet sightlines often ended abruptly at closed doors or heavy curtains. Natural light entered generously during the day, but by late afternoon shadows lengthened rapidly along the walls. The transition from brightness to dusk felt accelerated, as though the estate preferred obscurity. Christina's personal struggles, well documented beyond the island, cast subtle reverberations within its walls. The mansion became a retreat, not only from public scrutiny but from instability. Yet isolation can magnify what it attempts to silence. Scorpios was geographically removed from the world, but emotionally it held concentrated history. On certain nights, staff reported that Christina would remain awake long after midnight. Lights glowed in her quarters, while the rest of the house settled into darkness. The wind pressed harder against the shutters during those hours. The sea sounded louder, waves striking rock with rhythmic insistence. The estate seemed suspended between vigilance and exhaustion. In 1988, news once again traveled across water and stone with devastating clarity. Christina Onassis died in Argentina at the age of 37. Though her death did not occur on Scorpios, the impact landed there with immediate force. The island had become inseparable from the family's narrative. The mansion, once envisioned as a monument to endurance, now bore witness to another generational fracture. Ownership transferred to her daughter, Athena Onassis, still a child at the time. The estate, vast and silent, belonged legally to someone too young to remember its earlier vibrancy. After Christina's death, Scorpios entered a prolonged quiet. Visits became rare. The mansion was maintained, preserved meticulously, marble polished, gardens trimmed, roofs inspected. But preservation is not the same as habitation. The house stood prepared for occupants who did not come. Empty rooms develop their own acoustics. Air grows heavier without circulation of daily life. The scent of polish lingers unnaturally long. Curtains remain still for extended periods, their fabric absorbing stale sunlight. The once active kitchen cooled into disuse, stainless steel surfaces reflecting only dim maintenance lights. From offshore, the mansion continued to appear formidable, a white silhouette against blue expanse. But inside, time accumulated. The graves near the chapel remained tended, cypress trees thickened with growth. The island's vegetation grew denser around pathways once frequently walked. Nature pressed closer to architecture, subtly reclaiming what had been shaped and ordered decades earlier. Scorpios was conceived as permanence. Instead, it became a repository. Part 5. Silence, when prolonged, becomes structural. By the early 1990s, the Onassis mansion no longer functioned as a residence in the traditional sense. It existed in suspension, preserved but uninhabited, immaculate yet hollow. The Ionian sun continued to rise over its eastern facade, casting soft gold across the terraces. Olive trees shimmered in morning wind. The sea retained its impossible blue, but inside, the air moved differently. Without regular presence, sound behaved unpredictably. Footsteps from maintenance staff echoed more sharply along marble corridors. Doors, opened after weeks of remaining closed, released faint drafts of trapped air that carried the scent of polished wood and cooled stone. The house no longer absorbed human energy. It reflected emptiness. The main salon, once a theater of discreet power negotiations, stood arranged as if awaiting guests who would never arrive. Sofas remained precisely positioned. Crystal glasses were stored behind glass cabinets. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, and illuminated particles of dust suspended mid-air, drifting slowly like fragments of memory. On the western terrace, the horizon remained unobstructed. The Ionian Sea stretched outward in layered blues, dissolving into haze. This was the view that had symbolized conquest for Aristotle Onassis, an empire of ships moving across global waters, contracts spanning continents. Now, the same horizon emphasized distance rather than dominance. The chapel below continued to anchor the estate's emotional geography. The graves of Aristotle and Alexander Onassis remained tended with deliberate care. White stone markers caught midday light and reflected it softly toward the mansion above. The proximity between the house and the burial site created an inescapable visual dialogue. From certain upstairs windows, the alignment was unavoidable. Life once conducted in opulent rooms, death resting quietly downhill. Maintenance crews preserved the estate with almost ritualistic discipline. Floors were waxed, shutters inspected, gardens trimmed. Yet preservation without occupation creates tension. Rooms designed for conversation grew acoustically sterile. The dining hall's long table, capable of hosting heads of state, reflected only ceiling light. Silverware tarnished slowly if not handled frequently, requiring constant polishing to maintain illusion. The mansion's architecture, balanced, symmetrical, calculated, began to feel like a frame without portrait. Outside, the island shifted subtly with each passing season. Vegetation thickened along lesser-used pathways. Certain corners of the property grew quieter, as though even wildlife sensed the reduction in human activity. At night, the absence of interior light transformed the mansion into a dark silhouette against the water. From distant boats, Scorpios appeared less like a beacon and more like a shadow. Ownership technically rested with Athena Onassis, but her presence on the island remained rare. Raised largely outside Greece, she did not inhabit Skorpios in the way her grandfather once had. The mansion became an inherited weight, legally possessed, emotionally distant. In these years, rumors circulated beyond the island's boundaries, speculation about future sales, discussions of financial pressures. The idea that even this fortress of legacy might change hands introduced a quiet instability into the estate's identity. A house built to cement permanence now faced the possibility of transition. Within its walls, time pressed forward without witness. Paint maintained its brightness, but its meaning shifted. Bedrooms prepared for occupants remained unused. The air in guest quarters cooled into stillness. Linen closets held fresh sheets that carried faint sense of storage rather than life. The psychological impact of abandonment is rarely dramatic. It is gradual. It settles like dust, imperceptible at first, then undeniable. By the late 2000s, Skorpios felt less like a residence and more like an artifact. The wind that moved through cypress trees sounded sharper against unlit windows. The sea continued striking the rocks below with mechanical persistence. The mansion stood intact, resistant to decay, yet hollowed by absence. It had been designed as a sanctuary for dynasty. It had become a preserved echo. In 2013, the silence broke, not with voices inside the mansion, but with signatures far from its shores. After decades under the legal ownership of Athena Onassis, Skorpios was sold. The island, once acquired as a personal kingdom by Aristotle Onassis, passed into the hands of Dmitry Rybolovlev, a Russian billionaire whose name carried its own gravity in global financial circles. The transaction did not merely transfer property. It severed the final formal tie between the Onassis bloodline and the land that had held its greatest triumphs and deepest wounds. The mansion remained standing exactly as it had for decades: white stone walls, terraces open to the Ionian horizon, the chapel below still sheltering the graves of Aristotle and Alexander Onassis. The sale did not erase their presence. Ownership documents changed, but the soil did not. Under new control, plans for redevelopment emerged. Reports suggested renovations, modernization, transformation of the island into a more expansive luxury retreat. Yet the original mansion, the architectural core of the estate, carried limitations that blueprints could not easily dissolve. The building was not simply physical infrastructure. It was layered memory. When engineers and architects surveyed the property, they encountered a structure preserved in near-original form. Marble floors remained uncracked. Structural beams held firm. Terraces required maintenance but not reconstruction. Time had not defeated the mansion materially. Emotionally, however, it was saturated. Walking through its halls in the 2010s meant moving through a preserved environment shaped by mid-20th century ambition. The study still bore the proportions of decisive authority. The dining room still carried the geometry of power dinners. Bedrooms still faced the sea as though awaiting occupants who never returned. Renovation discussions confronted a quiet question: how much of the past could be altered without disturbing what lingered? The chapel remained untouched. Its white walls, modest and unembellished, continued to face the water. Cypress trees grew taller around it, deepening the shadows cast at dusk. The graves rested in disciplined simplicity, separated by only a short distance. Visitors walking from the mansion toward the chapel followed the same narrow stone path worn decades earlier. The island's climate remained constant: sun heavy in summer, wind sharper in winter. Salt air continued to settle against shutters. The Ionian Sea continued its indifferent rhythm. Yet something intangible persisted within the mansion's interior spaces. Large, empty rooms amplify memory. Corners retain echoes. Architecture, when designed for dynasty, struggles when dynasty dissolves. Skorpios was conceived as a controlled paradise. Trees imported, beaches reshaped, water systems engineered to defy natural limitation. The mansion stood as the centerpiece of that control. But history unfolded inside its walls in ways no architectural blueprint could anticipate. It witnessed global marriages and private fractures. It framed horizons of power and views of burial. It hosted the convergence of American political legacy through Jacqueline Kennedy and European shipping dominance. It absorbed grief after the death of a son. It stood silent after the death of a patriarch. It endured the fragile stewardship of a daughter and the distant inheritance of a granddaughter. Its story is not one of collapse, it is one of accumulation. The mansion still stands on Scorpios Island, facing the same horizon that once symbolized expansion. But the meaning of that horizon has shifted. Where it once suggested limitless reach, it now suggests distance, between generations, between ambition and outcome, between ownership and belonging. At night, when lights glow within the estate once more under new management, the structure appears revived from afar. Yet the graves remain, the wind remains, the sea remains. The house was built to secure permanence. What it secured instead was testimony. Within its walls, the Onassis era did not vanish. It settled, into marble, into wood, into the quiet between waves. The mansion endures, but it remembers.